Finn's climbing the steps, huh? Climbing the steps. The Worthington Farm, tour stop number 2 here at Monocacy National Battlefield. And much like the other farms that are on the battlefield, Worthington has changed significantly since 1864. If we were looking out across the front yard and beyond of Worthington Farm in '64, we would have had far less trees out here in front of us. A lot of the trees that are out here are actually used specifically to block Interstate 270 and some of the noise. We can hear that low roar in the background there, because unfortunately Interstate 270 splits our battlefield today. Now, what we also would have been able to see even easier than we can today is Thomas Farm, just off here slightly to the southeast of us. Thomas Farm is going to be the epicenter of the fighting here at the Battle of Monocacy, but to get there, Confederate forces have to come through here. So at around noon, we have had John McCausland's Confederate cavalry locate the Worthington-McKinney Ford, which is just off to the north of us from here. They will blow through a company of the 8th Illinois Cavalry and move up here onto the Worthington Plateau. Now, John Worthington and his family are actually hiding in the basement of this structure. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But John has actually moved up to his second floor windows and is watching as Confederate forces deploy across the front of his property. One of those cavaliers later wrote that we were told to tie up our horses or turn them loose. No man could be spared to hold them. John McCausland, the Confederate cavalry commander, has about 1,200 cavaliers with him, and he wants to put as much punch as possible into his attack. He believes he's gained the flank or the side of the Union line. He thinks he's dealing with just militia, and so he wants to blow through them. That's something to keep in mind when we're talking about Civil War engagements, particularly with cavalry, is because every fourth man would traditionally be used as a horse holder, okay? Somebody to stay behind and keep control of the horses. So you're going in with 25% casualties, or at least without 25% of your forces when this thing begins. But McCausland wants everybody in the fighting ranks, so the horses were tied up or turned loose. Now, McCausland's command is going to deploy in a line of battle across the front yard here and begin pushing east, heading for Thomas Farm. What he does not realize is that James Ricketts veterans are now taking up position along pretty much where 270 is today. Where the interstate is today was the property line between the Worthington Farm and Thomas Farm. And in 1864, there was a heavy rail fence along that property line. And it would be behind that rail fence that the skirmishers of James Ricketts' division would be deploying. As the Confederate cavalry approached within about 100 yards of that fence line, Ricketts' men are going to rise up. They're going to pour a withering volley into the Confederate advance and knock back John McCausland's first attack of the day. McCausland's cavaliers are going to fall back behind the house and back down the opposite side of the hill to rally. And then John McCausland is going to take a pause and try to figure out what exactly is in his front, because he's just run into something far harder than any militia. So he's now going to take his time. And it's going to be almost 2 hours before McCausland realizes that this skirmish line in his front only stretches so far to the south. And a second Confederate cavalry attack is going to begin around 2 p.m., sweeping south of us, around the flank of the Federal skirmish line, driving back those troops across Thomas Farm. Well, James Ricketts, he's going to rally his men, and he's going to throw in more troops, and they're going to counterattack right up the Thomas Farm lane, drive out the Confederate cavalry from the buildings of the Thomas Farm, and recapture those structures once more for Federal forces. By this point, it's getting on towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and Jubal Early has had enough. Things are taking too long. Early is now going to call upon one of his division commanders, this gentleman, Major General John Brown Gordon. Now Gordon, for those of you who are familiar with the American Civil War, you've probably run into him before. At Antietam in 1862, he was a colonel of the 6th Alabama Infantry, where he was wounded 5 times at the Bloody Lane. At Gettysburg in 1863, he was a brigadier general and helped smash the Union 11th Corps during the first day's fighting. A year after that, 1864, he is now a major general commanding a division of troops, about 3,500 men, soldiers from Georgia, Louisiana, and Virginia. His men had actually been north of us, along the Buckeystown Pike. And as some of them later wrote, and as actually Gordon later wrote in his own memoirs, they had had the unique experience of being able to watch a battle. They had literally been essentially camped out under the trees watching the engagement happening along Best Farm. Gordon talks about how his men enjoyed the day and how they would cheer when a particularly good shot happened and things of that nature. Until about 2 o'clock or so, a rider was seen galloping towards them, and the men in the ranks knew what that meant. And soon they were up once more and pushing south. They will cross the Worthington-McKinney Ford and move across the front of the Worthington property here, going over the toe of Brooks Hill. This heavily wooded hill we have off here to the south of us is Brooks Hill. It was not wooded like this in 1864. There was a fringe of woods near the top, but much of Brooks Hill was open at that time. And there was a lot more buildings around the Worthington farm here at that time as well. A lot more support structures, including enslaved dwellings and multiple barns for the Worthington farm. When Gordon's men deploy in this long line of battle, they're in the process of doing this around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the Confederate cavalry will try one more time at this point to break the Federal position at Thomas Farm. Once more they will attack, once more they will be thrown back, and this time they will fall back through the very ranks of Gordon's men. One of John Brown Gordon's brigade commanders, Brigadier General Clement Evans, will actually call out at this point and mock his fellow Confederates, telling his men, "Come on, Georgians, let's show these cavalrymen how to fight. It's just 100 days, men, and can't stand up to our troops." So this idea that the Confederate infantry are now throwing themselves at militia and 100 days men is still the mindset of much of the Confederate high command. And we're going to see what happens to Gordon's line, and specifically the Georgians, when we head for Thomas Farm. But before we move out of this area, I want everybody to join me down here by the porch. One of the interesting side stories we have here at Monocacy National Battlefield actually deals with underneath the porch here. While John Worthington was watching the opening of the battle from his upstairs window and actually was nearly wounded by a stray fire, his family and a number of his enslaved are hunkered down here in their basement. Now these windows were here in 1864, and this particular boarded up window was utilized by Glenn Worthington. Glenn is a 6-year-old little boy. He is watching the battle. Think about how you guys were when you were 6 years old. This would have been something absolutely terrible and amazing to see, and he wants to see what's going on. He'll be watching this engagement from that boarded up window. Now, when the fighting is over later in the day, he is going to come out with his family. You guys had asked about field hospitals. The Worthington farm will be a field hospital for both Union and Confederate forces. The story goes that the Worthingtons treated Confederate troops in the back of the house here, where the building forms an L shape, and Union troops were treated here in the front yard. Well, young Glenn Worthington, again, 6 years old little boy, I know how I was when I was 6. He wants a souvenir from this fight that has just occurred, and there's this pile of burning muskets somewhere here in the front yard. And he sees a bayonet amongst those burning equipments, and well, he really wants that bayonet. And the story goes he's fishing through the burning pile of gear, trying to get that bayonet out of there, and a powder charge that's amongst this gear goes off in the fire, and it blows a bunch of ash and sparks and whatnot into his face. And there's real concern in the Worthington family that he might lose his eyesight. They have his eyes wrapped for a couple of days. Fortunately for him, once they unwrap him to check him out a couple days later, his vision is returned and it's fine. So Glenn's going to get his bayonet, and he maintains his eyesight. He's going to actually stay here in Frederick County for much of his career, and he'll eventually be a very prominent judge here in Frederick County. He will write the first history of the Monocacy campaign, known as Fighting for Time, a book that is still in print today. That's published in 1928. And he is going to be the driving factor, or one of the driving factors, in establishing Monocacy National Battlefield. A little history of the National Park Service. The National Park Service is established in 1916. And in 1933, the national military parks, the Big Five, which include Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and Vicksburg, are turned over to the National Park Service. They had been administered by the War Department up until that point. They'll be turned over to the National Park Service, and there's this interest in the United States government of having more battlefields preserved. And so with the pushing of Glenn Worthington and this new drive within Congress, we would see Monocacy National Battlefield established in 1934. Unfortunately, while there had been plans to put forward funding at that time as well, no funding was available once the legislation is actually passed. And so Monocacy is a battlefield, or a National Park Service battlefield, in name only for about 40 years. And it wouldn't be until 1971 that we begin to get funds to start purchasing property and landscape preservation work in this area. Our first visitor center doesn't go in until 1991, and then of course the visitor center that we started at today is built in 2007. So a little bit of side history about the battlefield itself. Sir, how old are you? 14. 14, okay. This is a great example. So Glenn Worthington is 6. This gentleman here is 14. You actually would have been able to be in the Army at that age. Do you know what you would have been doing? Very good. A musician specifically. Okay. Could have been drums, could have been bugle, depending on what branch of the service. Could have been fife as well. But think about this. We have this fighting going on across the landscape. The civilians are getting involved with treating the wounded and taking care of the dead. But also, these forces engaged have these young men in their ranks to be musicians, and during the fighting to be stretcher bearers. So you would have had a really big job to do during the fighting, even if you weren't on the front ranks itself. Okay? So that's something to kind of consider as we go through today, is just the wide variety of jobs that would have been utilized out here. Now, what we're going to do is head towards Thomas Farm, which is that cluster of buildings we see off here in the distance. This will be a fairly short hop from tour stop 2 to 3. Does anyone have any questions about this part of the field before we move on? Yes, sir.
A lot of casualties here.
We do have the beginnings of the heavier casualties here, especially with that first Confederate attack running into the Federal skirmish line out here. But again, the real heavy fight is going to be at Thomas.